Something brutal just happened in the North Arabian Sea, and the consequences will not stop at Hormuz. They will reach Beijing, they will reach Tehran, and they will reshape the maritime order that has governed global trade for the past 40 years. On the morning of April 19, 2026, the United States Navy did something that no analyst seriously believed Washington was willing to do. After 6 steists, full hours of radio warnings, 6 hours of formal naval instructions, 6 hours during which an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel called the MV Tauska refused to stop, refused to respond, refused to alter course, and kept pushing through the North Arabian Sea at 17 knots toward Bandar Abbas, as if the most powerful navy on Earth was not standing directly in its path, the guided missile. Destroyer USS Spruance opened fire on the engine room. Within minutes, U.S. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit fast-roped from helicopters launched off the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli onto the deck of the Tauska. The ship was disabled, the crew and captain were seized, the containers were locked down, and what the United States found inside those containers is now sitting in American custody, being analyzed in laboratories that the Pentagon will not even publicly identify. 2 days later, on April 21st, television in front of the entire world. Before we go any further, ask yourself a simple question. Why did the captain of the cell, Tauska, refuse 6 hours of warnings from a U.S. Navy destroyer? Why would any commercial vessel choose to have its engine room disabled by naval gunfire rather than turn around and go home? The answer is buried inside the containers that American Marines just secured, and it tells you everything about what has actually been happening between China, Iran, and the global ballistic missile supply chain for the past 4 decades. According to ship tracking data compiled by the global intelligence firm Kepler and verified by Reuters, Newsweek, and the Washington Post, the Tauska's voyage was not a routine commercial run. It was a precisely choreographed weapons procurement operation. The vessel departed the Iranian port of Shahid Raja'i on February 22, 2026, just 6 days before the war between Iran, Israel, and the United States officially began. It transited the Strait of Malacca in early March. It called at Gaolan Port in Zhuhai on China's southeastern coast on March 9th. It then proceeded to Taikang Port north of Shanghai on March 25th, before returning to Gaolan on March 29th and 30th to load containers. From there, it stopped at Port Klang anchorage in Malaysia on April 11th and 12th, in a maneuver that maritime analysts identify as a textbook ship-to-ship transshipment used specifically to disguise the origin of cargo. And then, with its containers fully loaded, it began the run through the Gulf of Oman toward Bandar Abbas, the primary Iranian naval and commercial port. That is when the USS Spruance found it. That is when the warnings began. That is when the captain decided that whatever he was carrying was worth the risk of having his engine room blown apart by 5-inch naval gunfire. The cargo question matters because it is no longer a question. According to Reuters, citing U.S. maritime security sources, the Tauska was carrying what Washington classifies as dual-use items, which is the diplomatic euphemism for materials that have civilian cover stories but military end uses. The Washington Post identified Gaolan Port in Zhuhai as a known loading point for sodium perchlorate, the primary precursor for ammonium perchlorate, which is the oxidizer in solid rocket fuel propellant. According to analysis published by The Telegraph and reported by multiple Western outlets, 5 previous shipments from the same port aboard IRSL vessels named Hamuna, Barzan, Shabdas, Rayen, and Zardis have already delivered enough sodium perchlorate to Iran since hostilities began on February 28th to produce propellant for approximately 785 additional ballistic missiles. That is enough fuel to sustain Iranian launch rates of 10 to 30 missiles per day for roughly a full month. Sodium perchlorate is the foundational chemical that powers Iran's Fateh 1-10, Zulfagar, Khaybar Shekin, Haj Qasim, and Fateh missile families. These are the same missiles that have struck Saudi oil infrastructure, American military bases across the Gulf, and civilian infrastructure inside Israel since March of 2026. Without this single chemical, those missiles cannot be produced at scale. Without those missiles, the entire Iranian deterrent posture against Israel and the Gulf states begins to collapse. And the Tauska, according to the converging assessments of U.S. Central Command, the Department of the Treasury, and former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley, was attempting to add to that stockpile while a U.S. brokered ceasefire was technically still in effect. While Vice President J.D. Vance was preparing to fly to Islamabad for a second round of peace talks, while the entire diplomatic architecture of the negotiation track depended on the assumption that Iran was negotiating in good faith. Now look at the timing of what Beijing was doing in the same window, because the contradiction between China's public posture and China's apparent behavior is so stark that no diplomatic statement issued from any foreign ministry can paper over it. According to Bloomberg, reporting from mid-April 2026, Chinese President Xi Jinping personally telephoned Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and told him that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open as an international waterway, and that this was in the common interest of regional countries and the international community. Bloomberg described this as Xi's most explicit public statement against Iranian closure of the strait since the war began. China's official position, delivered directly to the leader of the most important Sunni oil-producing state in the Gulf, was that Hormuz must remain open and that commercial navigation must be protected. And simultaneously, on April 15th, just 4 days before the Tuska seizure, Trump revealed in a Fox Business interview that he had personally written to Xi Jinping requesting that Beijing not provide weapons to Iran during the conflict. The White House confirmed on the same day that Xi had assured Trump in writing that China would not supply weapons. 4 days later, the USS Spruance fired on a vessel that had loaded containers at a Chinese port, identified by the Washington Post as a sodium perchlorate hub, while sailing under an Iranian flag toward an Iranian military port. Either Xi did not know what was being loaded at Gowland, in which case the Chinese central government does not actually control the supply networks operating in its name, or Xi did know, in which case he lied directly to the President of the United States in writing. Both interpretations are catastrophic for Beijing's diplomatic standing, and both interpretations are now being analyzed in real time, inside Washington, inside Riyadh, inside Tel Aviv, and inside every Gulf capital that has spent the past 2 decades trying to balance Chinese economic ties against American security guarantees. Beijing's response to the Tuska seizure was immediate, predictable, and revealing in its contradictions. On April 21st, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun was asked directly at a regular press briefing whether the Tuska had been carrying rocket-fueled precursors loaded in China. His answer was carefully crafted to sound like a denial without actually being one. As far as I know, he said, "It is a foreign-flagged container ship. China opposes any malicious association and hyping up of the issue." In the same press cycle, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs separately expressed what it described as concern about the United States intercepting an Iranian commercial vessel. So Beijing's official position, delivered in the same 48-hour window, was that the ship had nothing to do with China, but that China was concerned about the seizure of the ship. Both statements by the same ministry in the same news cycle. The contradiction is not a translation error. It is the unmistakable sound of a foreign ministry being forced to occupy 2 incompatible positions simultaneously because neither one is survivable on its own. And while Beijing was struggling to construct that impossible diplomatic posture, the cargo of the Tuska remained in American custody, and Trump remained in possession of evidence that he could release at the moment of maximum strategic leverage. That moment has not yet come, but the evidence is now permanent, and the consequences for China, for Iran, and for the global maritime order are only beginning. To understand why this single boarding operation in the Gulf of Oman represents something fundamentally different from every previous escalation in this war, you have to understand the 4-decade history of weapons cooperation between Beijing and Tehran that the Tuska seizure has now publicly exposed. The relationship did not start in 2026. It did not start with the Belt and Road Initiative. It did not start with the 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership that China and Iran formalized in 2021. It started in 1980, in the opening months of the Iran-Iraq War, when the People's Republic of China began supplying weapons to the Islamic Republic at a scale that would shape the entire balance of power in the Persian Gulf for the next 40 years. By the late 1980s, China had transferred CSS-8 tactical ballistic missiles to Iran, the same missiles that would later become the technological foundation of Iran's Tandar program. China also transferred C-802 anti-ship cruise missile technology, copies of which are now in the hands of the Houthi militia in Yemen, where they have been used to attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea throughout 2024 and 2025. China also transferred Silkworm anti-ship missile technology, transfers that triggered direct American sanctions in the early 1990s, precisely because they represented a clear case of military capability transfer disguised under civilian commercial cover. None of these transfers were ever fully stopped. New Chinese companies replaced sanctioned ones. New shipping routes replaced interdicted ones. New shell company structures replaced exposed ones. The supply relationship continued underneath the surface, adapting to every layer of international pressure, until by 2026, the architecture connecting Chinese ports to Iranian military programs had become one of the most sophisticated sanctions evasion networks ever constructed. The Tuska's specific role inside that network is now a matter of public record. The vessel is part of the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines known as IRSL, a state-owned company that the United States Department of the Treasury formally designated as the preferred shipping company for Iran's proliferation activities and procurement agents. The Treasury imposed sanctions on Irisel in 2019, specifically because its vessels had been documented transporting items for Iran's ballistic missile program. The Tuska is not a rogue commercial operator. It is a known asset of a sanctioned proliferation network, operating under direct Iranian state control, attempting to run a U.S. naval blockade with cargo loaded at a Chinese port that the Washington Post had previously identified as a hub for missile precursor procurement. Charlie Brown, a former U.S. Navy officer and senior advisor at the organization United Against Nuclear Iran, told the Wall Street Journal on April 20th, 2026, that the Tuska was carrying something of value to Iran. It must have been worth the risk to try to run the blockade, he said, but they chose poorly. That phrase, they chose poorly, captures the strategic calculation that the Iranian leadership made when it dispatched the vessel. Tehran assessed that the cargo was important enough to risk an open confrontation with the U.S. Navy. Tehran assessed that the political cover provided by the Chinese loading port and the Malaysian transshipment stop would be sufficient to deter American interdiction. Tehran assessed that the diplomatic complications of seizing a vessel with Chinese commercial connections would deter the Trump administration from acting. All three assessments were wrong. The Spruance fired anyway. The Marines boarded anyway. The cargo is now in Treasury Department custody anyway. And every assumption that the Iran-China supply chain has operated on for the past decade has just been falsified in a single morning. The geopolitical implications of that falsification compound across every theater where Chinese maritime power is currently being tested. Beijing has spent more than a decade arguing, both publicly and through the architecture of the Belt and Road Initiative, that it is constructing an alternative global logistics network independent of American naval dominance. Chinese investment in port, infrastructure from Gwadar in Pakistan to Hambantota in Sri Lanka, from Khalifa Port in the United Arab Emirates to Piraeus in Greece, from Mombasa in Kenya to Djibouti at the entrance to the Red Sea, was sold to host countries as a commercial development project that would diversify their economies away from Western financial systems. The strategic subtext was always different. Beijing was building physical infrastructure that would allow Chinese commercial and eventually military shipping to operate along routes that did not pass through American-controlled choke points. The Tuska seizure has now demonstrated in a single morning of naval action that this entire strategic framework has a fatal vulnerability. The vessel was not stopped in American territorial waters. It was not stopped inside any formally declared exclusion zone. It was stopped in international waters in the Gulf of Oman because American intelligence had tracked it from its departure port, monitored its route across the Indian Ocean, assessed the probability of its cargo, and decided that the operational moment was right for interception. Wherever a Chinese connected vessel goes, American naval intelligence can find it. Wherever it is found, American naval power can stop it. The geography changes from the Strait of Malacca to the Bashi Channel to the Mozambique Channel to the Bab el-Mandeb. The outcome does not. Chinese investment in foreign ports does not insulate Chinese commercial operations from American interdiction. Chinese diplomatic relationships with transit countries do not protect Chinese cargo from American boarding. The alternative architecture exists on paper. The American capability to disrupt it exists in practice. The economic dimension of this exposure is as serious as the military dimension, and it is hitting Beijing at exactly the moment Beijing can least afford it. According to Chinese state energy data, and verified by multiple Western analysts, approximately 42% of China's total crude oil imports come from the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states. Chinese trade volume with the United Arab Emirates alone exceeds $90 billion annually. Chinese investments in regional infrastructure, including major stakes in Khalifa Port in Abu Dhabi, in Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 megaproject portfolio, and in Iraqi oil field development, represent hundreds of billions of dollars in committed capital that produces economic returns only when the Persian Gulf functions as a stable commercial environment. Every Iranian missile that strikes Saudi infrastructure damages Chinese investment returns. Every Shahed drone that hits an Emirati's facility destroys equipment that Chinese companies hold financial stakes in. Every day the IRGC continues to disrupt Hormuz transit. China loses commercial revenue across multiple sectors simultaneously. And here is the contradiction that Beijing cannot escape. The same Iranian missile production that the Tuska's cargo was apparently designed to support is the production that is destroying Chinese investment value across the Gulf. China's relationship with Iran is now actively damaging China's relationship with the Gulf monarchies that supply 42% of Chinese crude oil. There is no diplomatic formulation that resolves this contradiction without forcing Beijing to choose between Tehran and Riyadh. And every choice Beijing makes from this point forward will be parsed by every Gulf state, every Asian energy importer, and every shipping insurer in the global commercial maritime industry. The teapot refinery problem makes the Chinese economic exposure even more acute. According to industry analysts and reporting in Reuters, the small independent processing facilities concentrated in Shandong province, known collectively as the teapot refineries, account for approximately 25% of China's total refining capacity. These refineries were built around a specific economic model that has now collapsed. They processed cheap, sanctioned Iranian crude purchased at heavy discounts that were unavailable through legitimate market channels. The discount was the entire profit margin. When the United States naval blockade cut off the supply of discounted Iranian crude in mid-April, those refineries were forced to compete for replacement crude on the open global market at full commercial pricing. Their margins did not compress. They disappeared. Below zero margins across a quarter of China's refining capacity does not produce a manageable energy adjustment. It produces an industrial crisis that arrives simultaneously as an employment crisis in Shandong, one of the most heavily industrialized provinces in the People's Republic. China's strategic petroleum reserves, estimated at approximately 1.39 billion barrels, can cover roughly 120 days of national consumption at current rates. Beijing has already moved to protect the domestic market by banning refined fuel exports. But strategic reserves are not designed to substitute for ongoing supply chains. They are designed to provide a buffer during a temporary crisis. The Tuska's interception, combined with the broader American blockade of Iranian ports, is now extending what Beijing initially treated as a temporary crisis into a structural problem, with no obvious resolution path. The trilateral Russia-China-Iran axis that Western analysts have spent the past 3 years describing as the alternative pole of global order is now visibly fracturing under the specific pressures the Tuska seizure has exposed. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov appeared at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum in mid-April 2026 and condemned the American blockade as unlawful. He defended Iran's stated nuclear rights. He performed solidarity with Tehran for the cameras. And in the same statement, he announced that the Russian Federation stands ready to supply additional energy resources to China, to other countries affected by the crisis. Read that combination carefully. Moscow is performing public solidarity with Iran while privately advertising its readiness to replace Iranian oil in the energy markets that China requires. Every barrel of Iranian crude that cannot reach a Chinese refinery because of the American blockade is a barrel that Russia can now sell to China at terms increasingly favorable to Moscow. Russian energy revenues since the blockade began have approximately doubled, according to multiple Western analysts. China's desperation to find alternative crude supply is deepening Chinese dependence on Russian energy at exactly the moment Beijing was attempting to diversify away from any single source. Russia is not saving Iran. Russia is monetizing Iran's collapse. China is not defending Iran. China is now caught between three impossible positions, each of which accelerates the political and economic damage of the other two. Maintain the supply relationship with Tehran and accept exposure of the missile component pipeline, distance Beijing from Tehran and lose access to the discounted crude that the teapot refineries depend on, pivot toward Russian energy, and accept structural dependence on Moscow at the precise moment the Putin regime is exploiting global crises to maximize its own leverage. None of these options are good for China. All three are now being managed simultaneously inside the Chinese Politburo, and the Tuska seizure has narrowed the time frame for choosing between them from years to months. The intelligence dimension of what the United States now possesses is the part of this story that gets the least attention in mainstream coverage, and it is the part that will matter most over the next 12 months. When Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit secured the containers aboard the Tuska on the morning of April 19, 2026, they did not just capture a single shipment of missile precursors. They captured a complete operational picture of how the Iran-China supply network has been functioning. Every container that American analysts are now scanning is not just evidence about this specific cargo. It is a window into the entire logistics architecture that has been moving sensitive materials between Chinese ports and Iranian military programs for the past 4 decades. Which specific Chinese companies supplied the chemicals at Galan Port? How the payment structures were organized to obscure the transaction chain across multiple jurisdictions? Which shell companies in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai served as the financial intermediaries? Which freight forwarders coordinated the movement between Taikang, Zhuhai, and Port Klang? Hitch corporate fronts in Malaysia handled the transshipment that was specifically designed to launder the operational identity of the cargo between its Chinese origin and its Iranian destination. Every node revealed by analyzing those containers is now permanently compromised for future use. Iran cannot simply route the next shipment through the same companies, the same ports, or the same logistics intermediaries. Every link in the chain that American intelligence has now mapped is a link that cannot be reused without near certainty of detection. Rebuilding that network from the ground up is not a trivial undertaking. And it is not something that can be accomplished while the Iranian regime is simultaneously dealing with its own internal collapse. The IRGC is currently consolidating power inside Tehran while sidelining the civilian negotiators. The supreme leader has been invisible to the public for more than 50 days. The Iranian economy is bleeding $500 million per day under the American blockade, according to Trump's own public statements. Oil storage at Karg Island is approaching maximum capacity, which will force Iranian wells to shut in within weeks. The rial has collapsed past 1.32 million per US dollar on the black market. Inflation is running at nearly 70%. And in the middle of all of this, the Iranian regime is now being asked to design a completely new clandestine procurement network for ballistic missile precursors, identify new Chinese suppliers willing to accept the legal exposure of being on American intelligence's radar from day one, build new shell company structures across new jurisdictions, develop new transshipment routes through new ports, and do all of this while operating under the most comprehensive maritime surveillance regime that the United States Navy has imposed on any state actor since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Trump's casual line on CNBC about a gift from China was not just diplomatic theater. It was an announcement that the supply network had been mapped and that the cost of operating any successor network had just risen by an order of magnitude. The damage to Iran's near-term ballistic missile production capacity is the most immediate operational consequence of the Tuska seizure, and it deserves to be understood in concrete terms rather than abstract ones. According to the Telegraph's analysis published in the days following the seizure, the 5 previous IRSL shipments from Galan port aboard the vessels Hamuna, Barzan, Shabdis, Rayen, and Zardis had delivered enough sodium perchlorate to Iran to produce propellant for approximately 785 additional ballistic missiles. That figure assumes Iranian launch rates of between 10 and 30 missiles per day for roughly a month of sustained operations. The Tuska was attempting to add to that stockpile when it was intercepted. With the Tuska seizure, that resupply has been broken. With the broader American blockade in place, future resupply runs are now operating against a surveillance environment in which every IRSL vessel that approaches a Chinese port is being tracked, every cargo manifest is being analyzed, and every ship-to-ship transshipment in Southeast Asian waters is being photographed. Iran's missile launch rates against Israeli, Saudi, and American targets across the Gulf will fall as existing stockpiles are consumed without replacement. The Fateh 110, Zulfiqar, Kebar Shekan, Haj Qasim, and Fatah missile families that depend on solid fuel propellant produced from the Chinese precursor will see their production lines slow first, then stall. The Iranian deterrent posture against Israel and the Gulf monarchies, which has rested for 2 decades on the credible threat of mass ballistic missile bombardment, is now being measurably degraded for the first time since the program reached operational scale in the early 2010s. For the Gulf states watching all of this, and for Israel watching it with particular operational intensity, the Tuska seizure delivers something that years of diplomatic argument inside United Nations Security Council chambers could never produce. Concrete, physical, American-held evidence that Iran's ballistic missile program has been supplied through Chinese logistics networks, while Iran was simultaneously claiming to be open to negotiations on its nuclear and weapons programs. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are within range of the Iranian missile families that the Tuska's cargo was apparently intended to support. Every Iranian missile that does not get produced because its precursor supply has been interdicted is a weapon that cannot be aimed at Saudi oil refineries, Emirati ports, or American military bases stationed across the Gulf. Every production month that Iran loses while its supply network is being painfully rebuilt is a period during which the missile threat to the Gulf monarchies is marginally but measurably reduced. For Israel, the strategic implication is even more direct. Iranian ballistic missile capacity is the primary external military threat that has shaped Israeli defense planning since the late 1990s. Anything that degrades that capacity, whether through direct strikes on production facilities, through sanctions pressure on precursor supply, or through naval interdiction of logistics shipments in transit, creates strategic depth that Israeli military planners value in concrete operational terms. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's signaling about the prospects of a Lebanon ceasefire extension, which has emerged in close proximity to the Tuska seizure, reflects exactly this calculation. With Iranian missile production under sustained pressure, with the Iranian nuclear stockpile potentially on the negotiating table, and with the Iranian regime itself fracturing internally, the strategic environment that has constrained Israeli options for years is now visibly shifting in Israel's favor. The timing of the Tuska seizure, occurring while Vice President J.D. Vance was preparing to travel to Islamabad for the second round of U.S.-Iran peace talks, has also done something to the negotiation track that cannot be undone by any subsequent diplomatic statement. The United States now possesses confirmed operational evidence that during the